You're in a room, confused and scared. You look for a way out, but there is none. You decide to look into the mirror, to know your substance, even if just external, but nothing. There is no smile or frown to welcome you back. You know nothing, and yet you know one irrefutable truth. You are not alone. You are not alone, and yet you are utterly alone here. There are other yous out there beyond your reach. You as an existence are infinite, and yet you are infinitely trapped in this singular room, unable to escape, unable to search for answers, unable to even die. To mediate your dread, you read. Learn more about this room. But all the reading, all the knowledge in the world will not unlock that door. All of your books have taught you that you are one in a million yous, seemingly indiscernible from each other. But no, you refuse to accept this. So you chop off your hair, change your name, and adopt a tsundere persona. But even after your existential rebellion, you're still alone here. That is, until someone joins you in this room. And you know you must do everything in your power to keep them here with you, to give your life meaning. Doki Doki Literature Club is my third favorite game of all time. The questions it naturally poses are so life-wrecking when you really sit down and think about them. This would, of course, make me an existential masochist, apparently. But even with DDLC, many have criticized it for its slow start, which, while I thoroughly enjoyed the first half, I understand that it essentially plays as a standard dating sim visual novel, especially on a first playthrough. It takes a while to get to the horror at the core of its brilliant story. Miside, however, is completely different. It takes off like a roller coaster, going 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3 seconds. And while the game never actually breaks the fourth wall, it gets about as close as one could feasibly get. I call it the 3.5 wall, and in this sense, it shatters it. This video will have assumed you have experienced Miside in its entirety, as I won't be combing through the story beat by beat. So obviously full spoilers ahead, as well as the trigger warnings on screen now. Okay? Okay. So, if you're ready, I think it's time we dive headfirst into the existential nightmare that is Miside. Before I describe the 3.5 wall, I think it would be beneficial to catch you up on the fourth wall, so we're all on the same page. The fourth wall, in its most historical of definitions, is the imaginary wall that exists between the audience and the actors on stage. The term hasn't even existed for that long, as throughout most of history, the wall simply didn't exist. So I won't say that old dramas broke it, as it wasn't even there in the first place. When I traveled abroad to London for theater, I went to a lot of Shakespeare shows at the Globe. And in literally every one, the fourth wall was broken. I even remember one of the actors grabbing the drink of an audience member, drinking it, and incorporating it into the drama. Of course, that is a play through the modern lens. We don't expect such audience engagement. But during Shakespeare time and before and even after, such engagement was the norm. The audience was part of the show, and served not as an outsider observer, but rather a silent character in the play's world. The soliloquy was specifically designed to talk directly to the audience and share the character's often inner thoughts, as opposed to a monologue, which exists solely in the fictional world of the play. Eventually, when the concept of realism was integrated into theater, the fourth wall slowly developed. This means that in the modern sense, this is a wall that can be broken to great effect. Of course, the best example I can think of is Doki Doki Literature Club, but there are plenty more that I'm sure you already know about. Breaking the fourth wall, though, is not just engaging with the audience, but rather is acknowledging the audience is there to begin with. This naturally brings forth several concepts, but most important being that the characters know they're in a play, film, book, or game. Books in particular are interesting as they may have the loosest of all the fourth walls. Not only do they naturally engage the reader by initiating their imagination more so than a visual experience, but they are a character directly telling their story, at least when it's told from a first-person perspective. That by itself could constitute as a fourth wall break, but I would rather put it in the 3.5 wall territory, at least in most cases. This is because the characters don't actually know they're fictional. Rather, it's almost as if they're telling their story into the void. Even when they use terms like Dear Reader, it's more so as if a diary entry than them directly acknowledging that they are not real. Of course, there are exceptions. I can think of 3 great examples in books. Well, 2 books and 1 manga that perfectly encapsulate the 3.5 wall breaking. All of them being some of my favorite books of all time, and all of them being books I haven't completed because I'm a dirty millennial. The entirety of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov is told from the perspective of Humbert, in which he directly speaks to the reader, but it's more like the reader of a diary he is writing. Perhaps I'll make a full video on Lolita someday, as it's amazing, and I feel as if traditional analysts see it as a love story. The ending of The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison is a bit more abstract, and spoilers ahead, with the character essentially going insane, with an internal dialogue being presented. Of course, there are 2 distinct voices, one most likely being representative of the second consciousness that comes with the white gaze, the other being the main character Pecola herself. This is actually a technique I used a bit in my own short film Squid Boy, which you can find on YouTube by the way, as well as a lot in my feature film America Dreamin'. In those 2, it's more of a psychotic second self, but it's similar in concept. Again, while the protagonist does kind of talk to the audience, it's more so her talking to herself, just in an abstract way, with the address to the reader being more of a byproduct. Opus, by the world's greatest director, Satoshi Kon, no arguing there, is a manga that reinforces simulation theory, in that the world is generated as observed by the viewer, very similar to quantum mechanics. This is the most similar to Miside actually, and once again, it only breaks the 3.5 wall from up to what I've read, in that it's characters loading these levels. I'm sure you've noticed a common denominator with all of these brilliant stories. They never acknowledge that they're fictional, and more importantly, they're self-contained. They break a wall, but don't truly reach the fourth wall because they all have internal, self-sufficient reasoning behind them addressing any reader at all. There are internal mechanisms that allow them to break some boundaries, but to only get halfway to actually self-awareness. Undertale is a great game, one of my favorites even, but it's not my favorite fourth wall breaking game because I think DDLC is much better, but more importantly, because Undertale never breaks the fourth wall. Controversial, I know. It gets damn close, but never actually does. Instead, it eviscerates the 3.5 wall. Flowey acknowledges in Undertale that all of this is a fictional world, but it's fictional in that there are a million other worlds just like it. It's a game, yes, and he and Sans know this to be true. But, and this is vital, it's a game that your avatar is playing, not you. The logic behind its seeming fourth wall breaks is determination, which is a concept in-game. It's not like DDLC where they are blatantly self-aware. Rather, things like save points are internal mechanisms in Undertale, not the game, but Undertale the world. It never talks directly to you, the player, but rather dimension-hopping character you were playing as. The existence of souls is an important concept in Undertale, and even more important to today's discussion. This is the core mechanism behind the game's wall breaks, with it having the power of determination. But again, it's a self-sufficient system in that it is an in-game explanation. It's just barely self-contained enough to where I personally wouldn't call it fourth wall breaking. Flowey is the same way. He sees the game as an objective reality, and while it's fickle, it's importantly not actually fictional. He can see other universes and knows what you did in them, but it all exists within one reality. There isn't an added layer that can be breached, and voiceover note here, I think they use the term game to explain multi-universe theory, but it's still one reality, if that makes sense. Juxtapose this to DDLC. Monica is aware she lives in a game, sure, but she is also aware that you don't. That's the extra added layer. It's your reality, if you would. It's not hers. There is no internal mechanism that is constructed around her world. Rather, there is her world and then yours. To put it more simply, there is no middleman or separative interface at the end of the game. No protagonist or player character. Just you and her. Just Monica. Funnily enough, DDLC Plus actually kind of betrays this concept and introduces a corporation that offers that internal mechanism very specific to her world. This is to the point where I'm not even sure the new version even breaks the fourth wall anymore, and instead is much more like Undertale or Miside. But I digress, it's a video for another day, and I still love DDLC Plus, so whatever. I understand the Undertale thing specifically is a controversial take, so if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear about it in the comment. I also understand that a major part of the game breaks the fourth wall in concept, that being our very relationship to video games and art as a whole, so I can surely see an argument that would claim the game is a fourth wall breaking game simply because of that. But I would then compare it to the greatest game ever made, Nier Automata. It, like Undertale, has some wall-breaking elements, and a major theme is that the relationship to art. But in Automata's case, it actually breaks both the 3.5 wall, specifically with "you want to blank to be, don't you?" line, and then breaks the fourth wall with ending E. I just don't think Undertale ever truly does the latter. So we're all clear on the distinction between the 3.5 wall and the fourth wall. Good? Good. Now, finally, it's time to analyze what exactly Miside is trying to say, and how all its wall-breaking elements play a part in all of this. If Evangelion has taught me anything, it's that you may not exist without others. It's your interactions with others that ultimately form who you are. And without that, you are little more than a bundle of instincts. This is what separates us from most of the animal world. At least the animals that also have a brain. Which I'm pretty sure is all of them. I've talked a lot in this channel about free will. And while I don't think Miside inherently asks that same question, I think it proposes a different concept. What happens when you are created by a god and then left utterly alone in a house? And this very specifically juxtaposes against DDLC, because while Monica was made to realize this after a certain point in time, that she was more or less alone in a video game as the only sentient one, the many Mitas were born with this realization. The existential questions proposed in Miside, then, are not as inherently human, but are still just as human as Monica's crisis. In DDLC, Monica is essentially made not to be faulty, but not able to fulfill her innate purpose of being romanced by the player. In Miside, evil Mita is made faulty. which leads directly to her existential crisis. Not only can she not be with the player like Monica, but she can't even be sure she should exist at all. Actually, that's wrong. She can be sure. She simply shouldn't exist. In a more surface level interpretation, I'm sure we can all at some point in our lives have related to this sentiment. I know I, as a schizophrenic myself, have thought this countless times. Born just not without a purpose, but born without a reason. However, you don't have to experience psychosis or even mental illness in general to struggle with these very existential questions. To question our very fundamental nature, not even just why we were born, but rather what we were born as. But even deeper than that, it's interesting to note that in this hellish reality, you can be labeled as defective simply by not hitting a pose correctly. I think the game very specifically has you build different metas to show us this fact. That being faulty is, well, it's rather easy to do. Within a society, this is also the reality of the situation. If you don't meet certain societal expectations, you fail. And as we discussed in my very long mouthwashing video, an ego death such as this can even be worse than actual bodily death. Abject horror is a term coined by Julia Kristeva and is explored in a book I ordered but still somehow hasn't come in, Powers of Horror, an essay on objection. Now, the concept is quite complex and quite frankly goes into a lot of Freudian ideas that I simply don't understand, as I have yet to fully read them. It's not a coincidence, of course, that I connected this game to Evangelion, another series that deals heavily with Freudian psychology. And another coincidence, I actually just wrote a bit about the concept of objection in another essay I wrote for a book I'm working on, a book full of essays called We're All a Bit Psychotic. This specific essay is called The Death of the Schizophrenic, and while I haven't even completed this essay, I'll be using an excerpt from it and then filling in with relevant ideas and information from Miside specifically. I ask you this: what is death? This has been one of, if not the, fundamental question of human existence. A classic example, of course, being if I were to replace every single body part of myself slowly, would they still be me? A better way to frame this question, and more historically, I think, is asking if we replace all the parts of a ship, even down to the very wooden planks, one by one, little by little, is it still then the same ship it once was? I honestly think the answer to this is pretty simple and a bit boring. It's a different ship. Every second that you exist, you are processing something new. Every interaction you have in some small way is taking away a wooden plank from your mind and replacing it with a shiny new one. Over time then, you were completely reborn, not the same person you once were. But that of course begs a secondary, more interesting question. Then what is a person anyway? This very beautifully circles back to the foundation of the first question and asks not what the answer is, but rather why we are asking the question in the first place. The very act of questioning this seems to imply that we inherently believe that our lives, and even our minds, end at our nerve endings. That is to say, you are nothing but the body you inhabit. But even that conclusion is a bit strange. What is the you in this scenario? You inhabit a body? So then, what are you? As I discussed in an earlier essay, we are born within a collective, with our minds being formed from interactions with said collective consciousness. Okay, simple enough. I imagine it like this. It's a sea of free-flowing ideas with concept and experiences surging like waves that crash into other waves. In this way, we are all part of one giant brain, one giant collective. But the mind doesn't seem to be a huge fan of this. After all, as Neon Genesis Evangelion points out, if we are all merged into one entity, then we no longer exist. There is nothing to tether us to reality, nothing and no one to interact with, and more importantly, we lack a body in which to tether our experiences to. So while the formation of the mind is caused by a free flow of information, we are ultimately separated from that data collective by one thing and one thing only: our body. This is why we are so obsessed with death, and when we ask the question about the ship. Our ideas, our impact will live on, but our bodies won't. And honestly, to say we continue to live on because our memories do is, well, it's a bit shallow, right? We need a solidified space to encompass. A singular human experience is not without inherent connection to others, but it is still singular. There is only one you, and only you have the exact memories that you do. No other person in history, nor anyone that will ever exist, will have the same collection of experiences that you do. And especially not the same reaction to those experiences that you do. Congratulations, I officially deem you as unique. Our sanity is entirely dependent on that distinct uniqueness from others because it is the only thing that inherently separates us from others. Our tiny little minds cannot comprehend existing in a space that is not our bodies, so much so that the self is inherently hinged upon the mind-body structure. This is where the concept of objection comes into play, which, while I still need to read Powers of Horror, an essay on objection by Julia Kristeva, to fully understand this idea and thus complete this essay, I do think I have a basic understanding of the thesis of the book. It is essentially the fear or disgust we feel when seeing something, well, fearful or disgusting. But more importantly, the concept questions why we feel disgust or horror, which is then framed around the idea of experiencing a phenomenon that breaks us from our sense of self. Vomit, for example, reminds us of our bodily functions. And the eventual train of thought this inevitably leads to is perhaps the most primal fear of them all. Wait, I live inside of a body? Oh dear God, I'm gonna die some. The mind has trouble viewing itself objectively, as everything it has ever processed has been subjective. Literally everything you've experienced as a living human has been an observation of objective reality, which is then processed through certain filters in your mind, such as memories and personality, or from a much younger age, instinct. Your mind has never once been objective itself, though, as to think is to be subjective. So when the mind is faced with an objective truth that it will someday die, or perhaps even more horrific, that it exists in the first place, it subconsciously reels back in horror and disgust. To hark on that last point for a bit, the mind is not built to psychoanalyze itself. We all have main character syndrome, so to speak, and we all inherently view ourselves as the center of our universe. And honestly, we're not even wrong in doing that, as we are the center of our subjective reality. Think of it this way. When you are playing a Japanese role-playing game where they usually have self-inserts, silent protagonists, you see the other characters as being, well, characters. In this scenario, the protagonist of this game is your body, and you're the mind. In this scenario, your mind is the god of your reality. And God was not meant to question his own existence, as he is supposed to be the arbiter of what is real and what is not. It all goes through him. You are exactly the same way. Hear that sound? That's the excerpt ending. Now, this is the fundamentals of object horror, that there are more ways to metaphorically die than just bodily death. After all, as we've discussed, it's even unclear what bodily death means. This is where the concept becomes a broader idea, where we face societal death. Or we could also call it a different brand of ego death. I hearken this back to The Bluest Eye, where Pecola, the main character, experiences what is more or less an ego death at the end of the book. This is due to societal pressures to become something else, something the white gaze defines as beautiful. This directly parallels to Evil Mita's struggles, where she does not meet arbitrary standards of functionality and even beauty. And while this certainly isn't due to the white gaze like with Pecola, it still stands for comparison. A creator has created subjective parameters of which to measure worth. In Pecola's case, the creator is society, and in Evil Mita's case, the creator is the one who made the game in the first place. This is an important distinction, as with Pecola, the parameters of beauty are complete and utter racist bullshit. But with Evil Mita, it's a bit more fundamental, and yet just as terrifying. It's as if God dictated she ought to be discarded. But, of course, the existential crisis goes even deeper. She has to watch the other Mitas be happy with their player. They do not experience the same reality as Monica does, as they seemingly are content with their existence. This is why Miside barrels past the existentialism of DDLC, and while this doesn't make it better, it certainly serves to pose different questions. Evil Mita has come to terms with the fact that happiness is there. It is possible in this world. Just not for her. She cannot reach it because of the circumstances of her creation. Just like how Pecola cannot reach her desired beauty simply because her society has told her the color of her skin is not beautiful. Amongst other things, of course, all of Toni Morrison's work is incredibly complex. I don't want to seem like it's that simple. But the game does not simply tackle objection through just Evil Mita. After all, there are other characters here. There is only one you, and only you have the exact memories you do. No other person in history, nor anyone that will ever exist, will have the same collection of experiences that you do. And especially not the same reaction to those experiences that you do. Congratulations, I officially deem you as unique. Our sanity is entirely dependent on that distinct uniqueness from others because it is the only thing that inherently separates us from others. Our tiny little minds cannot comprehend existing in a space that is not our bodies. So much so that the self is entirely hinged upon the mind-body structure. Does that excerpt sound familiar? It's because it is something entirely unique to me and used a quote from the very video I'm using this quote in. Alas, I have subverted your expectations. This is where the 3.5 wall comes into play. Mila does not have a body as she is a video game character. But even worse, there are an infinite number of copies of her. If our sanity as people rests in knowing we have a bodily separation from others, well, then to be a Mita is to be insane. And I hate that term, as I've said in other videos, so you know I mean it when I say it. None of the Mitas have this inherent uniqueness, as they're all created with the same predispositions. Sure, they can give themselves a hat, a really cool one at that, but that doesn't mean they're like humans. While natural factors may be outside of our control, we at least have differing biological factors. We at least are not all born in the same exact environment, the same exact room. We, at least, are not a Mita. But no, Mila will not accept this. While the rest of the Mitas seem pretty chill with this concept, Mila is burdened with the knowledge of her existence, simply because she has decided to read books. And through that knowledge, she has understood not just the meaninglessness that is inherent to her existence, but the sheer multiplicity of it. She is an infinite existence with no inherent separation between herself and others. So she rebels against this, gives herself a new name and a haircut to distinguish herself from her peers. But even Mila acts like the other Mitas, perhaps even unbeknownst to her, and just wants to spend time with the player. Begs for them to stay, because their fundamental programming knows nothing else but that. In this way, she is Monica, just a bit more self-aware. So, is that the end? Is to be a Mita to be trapped in the hell of infinite existence? Trapped in a singular room, yet aware of other selves? The worst of both worlds. Stripped of both connection and yet any individuality? No. I refuse to accept that. I rebel against that idea. Play back the tape. Mila is burdened with the knowledge of her existence, simply because she has decided to read books. Because she has decided to read books. In this way, Mila is inherently different from the other Mitas, and that she alone has this existential crisis. She alone decided to read. The other Mitas, though they have the same programming, to not do that. They make their own choices. The game breaks only the 3.5 wall, so it does not raise the truth that these are, at the end of the day, video game characters from our perspective. Rather, it wants us to suspend our disbelief just enough to see them as being capable of real-time decision-making. Call it free will or call it a facade. That's ultimately up to you. But just know that you, like Mila, have a choice in that. Reading is vital. And while it does not bring Mila personal liberation like it does for the protagonist of Afterimage, my favorite novel, through the mental framework of Jane Eyre, it brings her something equally as important. An existential crisis. Abject horror is, well, horrifying. It's not easy to question your own existence through the questioning of your own death, whether that be physically or mentally. But it's the fact that you are asking that question. That's what separates you from infinity, from instrumentality. You're in crisis. And that, I think, makes you unique and beautiful. And absolutely nobody, no society or God, can take that away from you. Because, at the end of the day, to question your human existence is, fundamentally, what makes you human. And, as always, thank you for watching.